welcome all. And so it's wonderful to see so many of my friends out there. Thank you for tuning in. I hope I'll entertain you for the next hour, telling you about the history of Palm Beach, the first 50 years, basically, from the first time the European settlers arrived in 1870 until really the boom years of the 1920s. And this lecture will be based on the book, An Illustrated History of Palm Beach, which I co-authored along with the Historical Society of Palm Beach County, which is located in the historic courthouse at 300 North Dixie Highway in West Palm Beach, along with the Richard and Pat Johnson Palm Beach County History Museum, which I commend to you. And this lecture series will have two parts. Both parts will together include over 500 vintage photographs, virtually all of which are from the archives of the Historical Society and are searchable online if you want to check out the website at www.pbchistory.org. So without further ado, the prologue. So Palm Beach County is what's on the map here. And it is the largest in terms of surface area of the 67 counties that make up Florida today. Florida has the third largest population in the country now, 21 million, surpassing New York 3 or 4 years ago. And the county seat is in West Palm Beach, with it currently has a population of 117 million. There are 38 municipalities in Palm Beach County, and the county has a total population of 1.5 million, the third largest population of any county in Florida. And the town of Palm Beach has a population, permanent population of 9,000 and a seasonal population of 20,000. So that's what Palm Beach is like today. And what we're going to talk about over the next two lectures is how Palm Beach went from a complete wilderness 150 years ago to the wonderland that it is today. To set the stage, let's go back to the time before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. And at that time, Native Americans lived throughout the state of what is now Florida, and particularly in the Palm Beach County area. There were three tribes, the Yega, the Ayes, and the Hobe, around Jupiter Inlet.
You can see that listening to this.
There are other tribes as well. You'll see, like Miami. The Miami weren't in Miami; they were actually in around Lake Okeechobee, but there was a river that led from Lake Okeechobee to what is now Miami, which is where the city of Miami got its name. The Tequesta were nowhere near Tequesta, next to the Jupiter Island area. That was some developer's idea. The Tequesta were actually down near the Keys. And another great tribe were the Calusa on the West Coast. And you'll see that other names that are familiar with you in Florida are derived from, or city names that are derived from Indian tribes like the Ocala, Pensacola, Apalachicola, and so on. And these Indians ate a lot of shellfish, and they disposed of the shellfish, creating ultimately large mounds of shellfish, which they built their housing upon along the shore, among other things, to get the breeze coming offshore, and other words, also to protect them from rising tides, particularly when there would be storms. There are, in fact, in Palm Beach County, many of these mounds, these shell mounds known by architects as middens, all around Palm Beach County, but particularly the Belle Glade mounds to the left of the slide there next to Lake Okeechobee. So the Spanish period. So the big events were the discovery of Florida by Ponce de Leon in 1513, and the founding of St. Augustine by Pedro Menendez de Aviles in 1565. Earlier, Columbus, in fact, had discovered Cuba in 1492 before Ponce de Leon arrived in La Florida 20 years later, 20 years later. A name that you will run across if you live here any time is Jonathan Dickinson. He was a Quaker from Philadelphia who was on a ship working its way from Jamaica back to Philadelphia in 1696. And that ship foundered near Jupiter Inlet, and he was captured, and the 22 other members of his party were captured by the Hobe Indian tribes. And he wrote, ultimately he was released, and they were allowed to work their way 200 miles north on foot, all the way to St. Augustine, where they finally managed to get back from there to Philadelphia. In any event, he wrote a journal about this, which is actually the first recording of what the native Indians were like and how they lived in our library. This journal was only published, interestingly enough, in 1945 by Charles Andrews, cited at the bottom there. And there's Florida has markers all over the place recounting the principal historical events of a particular location. And this one is located at Jonathan Dickinson State Park, which is in Hobe Sound, just across the county line north of us. That is not where the shipwreck took place, of course. It's just named after Jonathan Dickinson. The shipwreck took place on the coast next to Jupiter Inlet. And there's another marker just south of the inlet marking the so-called Midden, which is where the village of this says Yega, but I've understood it's the Hobe, had their village when Jonathan Dickinson was imprisoned. And this is what the Midden looked like 130 years ago. It was 20 feet high and 600 feet long. It was huge. It was made of shellfish, shells rather. And as a result, over time, when developers got to Florida and they were needing materials from which to build roads, they backed up the hose to these mounds of shells and started using those shells to cover roads. And as a result, the current Midden, the one that used to be 600 feet long, is now only 90 feet long. And if you go to the Du Bois Park, just south of Jupiter Inlet, you can visit the Du Bois house that was built there in 1898 on top of this Midden. Little known fact was that Florida, for this 20-year period, was occupied by the British. What happened was that during the 7 Years' War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, in the United States as the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, the Spanish, unfortunately for them, sided with the French against the English. And the English during the war captured Havana. And after the war was over, they worked out a deal with the Spanish that they would exchange Havana for Florida. So for the 20-year periods between the end of that war and the end of the American Revolutionary War, where it was when Florida was returned to Spain, it was actually under British control and was divided into East and West Florida. The capital of East Florida was St. Augustine. The capital of West Florida was Pensacola, and it went a lot further west than it does today. Jupiter Inlet. Jupiter Inlet was named Jupiter by the British during that period that they controlled Florida. Why did they name it Jupiter? Well, recall that the Hobe Indians lived around there, and the Spanish called the Hobe Indians Hobe. They pronounced it Hobe in the Spanish fashion, J like an H. And when the English arrived, they heard Hobe and they understood Jove. And the more common name for the Roman deity Jove is Jupiter. So they converted Hobe to Jove to Jupiter. When the Spanish left at the time of the British occupation, they took most of the surviving native Indian tribes with them, and there weren't many who did survive either the warfare or the diseases brought by the Europeans. And into the vacuum came the Seminoles, who were actually a Creek tribe that originated in the Carolinas and moved gradually south into Florida around 1750. So now we are setting the stage for the occupation of Lake Worth country. So major events. There were 3 Seminole Wars. First one when Florida was still under Spanish control. Then in 1822, Florida became a territory. Spain ceded it to Florida. Second Seminole War. In 1845, Florida became the 27th state. Third Seminole War, Civil War, and then the Homestead Act of 1862, all of which led to the south part of Florida being discovered or occupied by pioneers. So the main characters in the Seminole Wars, Andrew Jackson fought the first Seminole War, and he was the first territorial governor of Florida in 1822, and the city of Jacksonville was named after him in 1832. As a result of the first Seminole War, the Seminoles were essentially in the northern part of Florida, but they were pushed south into the central part of Florida, indicated by this arrow. In the Second Seminole War, a number of important events actually took place in Palm Beach County. There were the battles of the Loxahatchee, fought literally around the Loxahatchee River, which flows into Jupiter Inlet on January 15th and 24th, 1838. Both of those battlefields are now in Riverbend Park, which is a wonderful park just off of Indiantown Road, west of I-95. If you haven't been there, a great place to go for the battlefields, for kayaking, for biking, the works. Military Trail. We've all driven around here and noticed Military Trail. Where does it get its name? Well, actually what happened was during the Second Seminole War, Major Lauderdale was dispatched to hack a trail from Fort Jupiter, which was on the Loxahatchee River, to the new river, which is in Fort Lauderdale. And when he got to the new river, he built a fort there, which was named after him, Fort Lauderdale. And the 60 miles from Fort Jupiter to Fort Lauderdale was the Military Trail. And that Military Trail was extended both north to Fort Pierce and south to Fort Dallas, which we'll talk about later, for a total distance of 160 miles. The last commander of the US forces during the Second Seminole War was Colonel William Jenkins Worth. And in 1941, a group of soldiers left Fort Jupiter to explore, and they came across 10 miles south of there, a 22-mile long freshwater lake, which was called by the Indians Hypoluxo, which means water all around, no get out. But they thought it would be more appropriate to name it after their colonel, Lake Worth. And of course, Worth Avenue was named also after Colonel Worth. After the Second Seminole War, Colonel Worth moved to Texas, where he prosecuted the Mexican-American War, and that's where he died in 1849. He's buried in Worth Square in New York City, and Fort Worth in Texas is named after the same man. So after the Second Seminole War, the Seminoles were pushed further south into the Everglades. This wonderful map of 1842 shows pretty much where the Everglades were. 1845, Florida became the 27th state. We, for the first time here in Florida, had a population of 60,000 people. the entire state. Most of them were clustered around the northern Georgia border. And 60,000 was the minimum number of people that was required to qualify for statehood. Third Seminole War in the 1850s. Now we've got photography to help out, which is great. Chief Billy Bowlegs, no doubt a version of his name. The Indians lost this war too, and mainly were deported to the reservations in Oklahoma, but a few of them sought refuge even deeper into the Everglades, particularly in big cypress swamp part of the Everglades. And there were roughly 3,000 of them. There are roughly 3,000 of them still largely in the Everglades, in the big cypress reservation today. And this is a wonderful picture of one of their villages in the Everglades. Then after all the Seminole Wars, there was, of course, the Civil War, and Florida was on the side of the Confederacy. Finally, after the Civil War, after the Seminole Wars, it became safe in Florida for people to venture south. And it was the beginning of the so-called pioneer era, which lasted a very short period of time, less than 25 years. The earliest structure built in Palm Beach County was the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse, because after the war, this was built before the war, but there was more and more shipping up and down the coast. And actually, Jupiter Inlet sticks out a little bit, as you can see, well, you will see in the following slide. And therefore, there were an exceptional number of shipwrecks that occurred along there, and for that matter, along the entire Florida coast. So in order to warn ships, the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse was built in 1860, and the lighthouse tenders were actually the very first European settlers to move into South Florida. In 1875, again, to save people who were stranded after shipwrecks, the federal government constructed 5 so-called houses of refuge in Brevard County, north of Dade County, and in Dade County. The only one that's in Palm Beach County was in what is now Palm Beach County was the Orange Grove House of Refuge, which was built, which was near present-day Delray, but it burned down in 1927. The only one that still exists is Gilbert's Bar, as in Sandbar on Hutchinson Island in Martin County, and it's now operated by the Martin County Historical Society and is well worth a visit. So 1870, the population of Florida is now up to 187,000. The population of Dade County, which goes all the way from Gilbert's Bar in the north down to the Keys, this huge expanse, the population is 85 settlers. The largest city in Florida in 1870, Key West, believe it or not, which is about as far from Florida. It is as far as Florida as you can get, because of course it was an island which is a lot closer to Cuba than it was to mainland Florida. But curiously, with the small population of 5,675, it had the largest population of any city in Florida. Second, St. Augustine. This arrow points to the Everglades, and next to the Everglades, it says unsurveyed and unexplored. And that applied to a lot of South Florida in the 1870s. The very earliest settlers came down from the north. They were not coming from other southern states. The southern states were in Reconstruction, and the southerners really didn't go anywhere. So very interestingly, most of the pioneers came actually from the north, from places like New York or Michigan Pennsylvania, not from Georgia or North or South Carolina, for example, and they would settle on the shores of Lake Worth, and in particular on Hypoluxo Island at the southern end of Lake Worth. It was a rough and ready crowd, and it was a total wilderness. They were attracted by many things, but one of them was the so-called Hampstead Homestead Act of 1862. And it provided that any head of a family or any person over 21 who was a US citizen would receive 160 acres of land free of charge if he built a home on the land, cultivated it, and resided there for 5 years. So this is the homestead grant to Hannibal Pierce in 1883. And this is Hannibal Pierce's house in a photograph from 1873. And the pioneers back then, they made their houses from whatever they could find. It was just, there was obviously no supplies. The nearest store was in Titusville, halfway up the state. So everything they made, they salvaged. This is called Castle Canvas, another residence built by a pioneer, and a thatched one as well, similar to a guy named Hammond, who, if you know Hammond Avenue in Palm Beach, he lived in a house like just like this, right near Worth Avenue. And they were farmers, and their principal crop in the early going was pineapple. So there are actually pineapple fields up and down particularly the west side of Lake Worth in what is now West Palm Beach. For example, the cemetery where the Norton Museum is, and the cemetery behind it were pineapple fields once upon a time. Many colorful people moved down here. One of them was George Potter, who moved here at age 30. He was originally from Ohio, I believe, but he had been in Miami before coming here. And he did many, many things. This is, he killed the huge alligator known as Old Grandfather. But he was around for a good long time, and he had an illustrious career. Among other things, he had his own homestead called Figalis. Figalis means potter in Latin, so that was clever, 160 acres for him, just south of the Bath and Tennis Club today. He owned a lumber company with a fellow pioneer named Lanehart. He was the city surveyor in West Palm Beach. And luckily for us, he was an artist because he did some of the greatest sketches of what Palm Beach was like during the pioneer era, including this wonderful sketch of the bane of their existence then, and much less now, thanks to fumigation. But this one is entitled The Evolution of the Mosquito, which was and you can see at the start, it starts small, but it gets bigger and bigger until it finally is dwarfs man. George Washington Lanehart moved here in 1886. He was a master carpenter, and he became a partner with Potter in the lumber firm Lanehart and Potter. Here's another sketch by George Potter. This one is not actually of the Providencia, but nevertheless, in 1878, a Spanish ship loaded with 20,000 coconuts ran aground, and on its way from Trinidad to Cadiz in Spain, ran aground just south of today's Bath and Tennis Club. The settlers planted the entire cargo of 20,000 coconuts, which soon grew into a dense coconut grove and changed the landscape of Palm Beach forever, and future, the destiny of Palm Beach forever. And this is a picture of the Potter family and the Lanehart family in that coconut grove some years later. Second, one of the most influential people in Palm Beach was Elisha Cap Demick, seated on the left with a mustache with his family. He came down here with his family in 1876 from Michigan. How did they get here? I love the next 5 slides. This will show you what it took for the pioneers in 1876 to get to Lake Worth country, as it was called. You could actually get as far as Jacksonville at the top there by train, but then no trains. So you would hop a steamer and go up the St. Johns River, because it actually flowed from south to north. So you would go up the St. Johns River, which is the longest river in Florida, to Palatka at the bottom of the map. This might have been the ship you were on, through this jungle wilderness on either side, maybe stop in Palatka. And then you would keep going from Palatka all the way to the bottom right on this map to Salt Lake. And then you would take a wagon drawn by mules from the 8 miles from Salt Lake across palmetto roots and through deep sand to Titusville at the bottom right here. And there you would get on a sailboat and go the last 120 miles on the Indian River Lagoon, which would ultimately take you to Jupiter Inlet. And if you've ever been to Hope Sound or Jupiter Island, the body of water to the west of Jupiter Island is the Indian River Lagoon, and it carries on all the way to Titusville. Once you were Jupiter Inlet, your journey was not over. You then had to make it to Lake Worth. And in order to get there, there was a narrow so-called sawgrass channel that led most of the way from Jupiter, but it was so narrow that you couldn't sail anymore. You had to take your sail down and pole most of the way to Lake Worth. It would take all day to get there. And then you would get to the last bit, which was the so-called haulover, which was 924 feet long, according to this sketch, once again by George Potter. This is a photograph of the haulover canal in Titusville to give you an idea of what it looked like. And then finally, once you got to Lake Worth, you would get on a sailboat, or no, this would be the sailboat that had been dragged over the haulover into the lake. And then from there, that's how people got around. There were no roads, of course, in Lake Worth country. And so people all lived on the lake, and they traveled mainly around by these little sailboats known as Sharpies. There was a road, however, on the east coast, east bank of Palm Beach Island of Lake Worth, which is now known as Lake Trail. Later on, steamboats arrived. This one's called the Lake Worth, to help move passengers and produce and merchandise around the lake. And steamers, paddle wheelers arrived on Lake Worth as well. So civilization started slowly to develop in the Lake Worth area. And one of the first things that indicates civilizations arrived is a post office. And the first one on what is now the island of Palm Beach was called Tustanegee. But it didn't have very reliable mail service. So for example, there was no service from Lake Worth to Miami. So if you wanted to mail a letter from Lake Worth country, Tustanegee to Miami, the way you would do it is that you'd have to mail it, and here's the route it would take. It would go north to Jacksonville, then take the train across to Cedar Key on the west coast of Florida there. Then it would take a ship down to the largest city in Florida at the time, Key West, at the bottom. And then it would take another ship over to Fort Dallas country. Took 8 weeks, a long time. So in order to cut that time down, between 1884 and the next 9 years, the post office employed barefoot mailmen, they were known, who would travel on foot or by boat the 136 miles round trip between Lake Worth country and Fort Dallas country, 80 miles on foot and 56 miles in boats. These images are from work program administration murals that were painted in the Palm Beach post office that are now in a post office on Summit Avenue. So as I said, civilization started to arrive. The first hotel was the Coconut Grove House, which was our friend Elisha Demick's residence until he added 8 rooms in 1880 to make it into a hotel. Ultimately, it grew to 50 rooms. And this hotel was located about 200 yards south of the Whitehall on Lake Trail, where there is this marker to indicate the spot. And where Whitehall was originally called Bonefish Point, and when the Brailsford brothers bought it, it became known as Brailsford Point. And the Brailsford brothers established the first general store, which must have been a relief since you didn't have to go all the way to Titusville to buy sugar and coffee and so on. And at that general store, they also established the Palm Beach Post Office. And that is where Palm Beach in 1887, finally the name Palm Beach was associated with the land on the east side of Lake Worth. Another improvement for travel and for the pioneers was in order to make it a little easier to get from Jupiter Inlet to Lake Worth, there had been a so-called hack line, which is a stagecoach affair for a few years. But then in 1885, a railroad was actually built that connected Jupiter Inlet and Lake Worth. And it was known as the Jupiter and Lake Worth Railroad, but informally it was known as the Celestial Railroad because it stopped in Jupiter, town Mars, Venus, and Juno at the northern shore of Lake Worth. It went out of business in 1994 when the Florida East Coast Railroad arrived in West Palm Beach, bypassing Jupiter Inlet. But because of it was now relatively easy to get to Lake Worth country, then more and more snowbirds started to arrive, people who were not pioneers anymore, but people who were coming with certain means, and they built houses. And one of the very first was Robert McCormick, who engaged our friend Mr. Lanehart that we saw earlier to build him Croton Cottage on the shores of Lake Worth. Charles and Florence Cragen, who were from Philadelphia, built their house in the north end of what was Palm Beach, and they called it Rêve d'été, summer dream. A family from England, from Staffordshire, England, the Maddocks, built their house on the lake, and they called it Duck's Nest. And Commodore Charles Clark in 1893 actually purchased Coconut Grove House, which burned down very shortly after he bought it. And in its place, he built his own house called Primavera. And Charles Bingham purchased Figalis from George Potter, kept the name Figalis, but had George Lanehart, once again, the master carpenter who built Croton Cottage, build him a house, which he called Figalis. And it was a wonderful shingle style house. And also it was the first house in Palm Beach built on the ocean. Sadly, it no longer exists. First school was set up in 1886 on Lake Trail. Everything was on Lake Trail. First church, Bethesda by the Sea, on Lake Trail. Second church, Bethesda by the Sea, also on Lake Trail. The first one no longer exists. The second one does. And anybody who's walked on Lake Trail has walked by it. It's now a private residence right next to Duck's Nest, and not far from the vicarage, which was similarly built on Lake Trail. So remaining from the pioneer era, you do have all these wonderful buildings that are still visible. The Little Red Schoolhouse has been moved from Lake Trail down to Phipps Ocean Park, and Croton Cottage is now called Seagull Cottage, and you can visit that. Duck's Nest is visible from Lake Trail, as is the second Bethesda by the Sea church and the vicarage. So now, after only 25 years, the future of Palm Beach is totally turned upside down by the arrival of Henry Morrison Flagler, who made his fortune as a partner of Rockefeller in Standard Oil. And he retired young and rich and came down to St. Augustine with his ailing first wife in 1878 on doctor's orders, hoping that it would be good for her health. In fact, she died, and he came back with his second wife. And he was displeased by the quality of accommodation and transportation, for that matter. And so Flagler built the Hotel Ponce de Leon and another one called the Hotel Alcazar to improve accommodations there. And he resolved to develop Florida. And the way he did it was, first he built the Florida East Coast Railway down the east coast of Florida. First he went from St. Augustine down to Ormond, which you can see on the right here, where he built a hotel. Then he went exploring further south. And he came down to Lake Worth country, to Palm Beach, and he discovered, as he was sailing along, this magnificent grove of palm trees that made Palm Beach look like nothing else that he'd seen north of it. And fantastically, just on the west of this grove was a freshwater lake. So it was a unique, and it was relatively accessible, thanks to the infrastructure that I mentioned earlier. So he resolved that this would be where he would establish his newest resort. And his visit in 1992, he made the decision and he bought Croton Cottage from Mr. McCormick. And that was his residence for the next 10 years. And he bought Brailsford Point from the Brailsford brothers, just north of Croton Cottage. This was a time when the first bank, Dade County, remember that Palm Beach was in Dade County at this point, and the first bank was set up in Palm Beach, actually, right next to the property of Flagler in this little building, which some of you old-time Palm Beachers may recall, because at one time this building, which was moved over to West Palm Beach many years ago and shifted around, it was one time on Clematis Street as Johnny's Playland, and it's now located on 4th Street and North Flagler Drive, right opposite the Chamber of Commerce. This is a wonderful map from 1907 that shows you the Palm Beach of Flagler. On the right, you see his hotels on the island of Palm Beach, the Royal Poinciana Hotel on the lake, well set back, I would point out, from the lake's edge, and on the eastern side, the Breakers Hotel, one opposite the other. And then directly opposite them was downtown West Palm Beach, which was built to support the resort of Palm Beach. And here just looking at Palm Beach, you will see that there are early pioneers, those snowbirds that I mentioned that built houses there. So Flagler didn't buy all of the houses. So there's still some of the pioneer houses left. And they built, as you can see, all of the houses are located on the lake, but the property goes all the way to the ocean. And you'll see some familiar names here. There's Pendleton House, there's Barton's Trail, there's Clark's Trail, there's Demick's Trail. And also what's quite remarkable here is you can see that all of those trails, so to speak, have this lagoon that's right in the middle of the island. So when you're driving down Coconut Row, south of the what used to be the Royal Poinciana Way, and it's flooding. This is why, because it was filled in, but it was originally very marshy, as was this stretch here. And at the very south bit, you'll see, and we'll come back to this later too, is Jungle Trail, the squiggly bit here. And on the west end of it was Alligator Joe's alligator farm. This is what Barton's Trail looked like. And this is what Clark's Trail Lagoon looks like in the 1890s when Flagler showed up. Lake Trail, and there weren't too many roads, and they were mainly just paths, footpaths. Flagler made short work of building his first hotel, the Royal Poinciana Hotel. The first version of it opened in less than a year after construction began in 1894, and it consisted of 540 rooms. It was an immediate success and had to be expanded twice. And by 1901, the number of rooms had increased to 1,081. It was the largest hotel in the world and the largest wooden structure in the world, with I think 3 miles of corridors. This was the front of the hotel, or well, yes, overlooking the lake. Quite magnificent. And on the ocean, Flagler built shortly thereafter another hotel called the Palm Beach Inn, which similarly was expanded because it was successful. And in 1901, it was renamed the Breakers, famous for its rocking chairs, on its veranda. And Flagler built the little church, as it was called, for the guests to attend, now known as the Royal Poinciana Chapel. There's a picture of the workers nearing the completion of the Royal Poinciana Hotel. They're all white, and the white workers lived in a tent city near today's Seaview Avenue, south of the church, the hotel, and the black workers lived in an area known as the Sticks, which was north of the hotel near today's Sunset and Sunrise Avenues, which was closed in 1910, and that area was redeveloped as the Floral Park addition with Sunrise and Sunset Avenues in that spot. As I mentioned, West Palm Beach was developed simultaneously with these hotels, and it was laid out by the city surveyor, none other than George Potter. And this is a little blurry, so it's difficult to tell, but the arrow on the left is pointing to, so the streets, it's a grid pattern, which exists still today. And the streets are organized in alphabetical order. So at the top, it says Althea Street, which is now, I think, 1st Street or 4th Street, I'm not sure. Then Banyan Street, then Clematis Street, then Datura, then Ivernia, then Fern, and so on. And the same thing works for the north-south streets, and the arrow is pointing to Poinsettia Street, which is now North Dixie. So train arrived, Florida East Coast train that Flagler was building arrived in West Palm Beach in 1894. After the hotel, Royal Poinciana Hotel opened. So until the arrival of the train, people had to take a ferry from West Palm Beach to Palm Beach. And this is a view of West Palm Beach from the Royal Poinciana Hotel with the ferry on the left. The first railroad bridge, sometimes called a spur, was built connecting West Palm Beach and Palm Beach in 1896. So not that long, 2 years after the Royal Poinciana Hotel started. And it would take guests right up to the front door of the Royal Poinciana Hotel and then carry on to drop other guests off right in front of the breakers, and then would carry on down the 1,000-foot long pier where guests and cargo could board ships, also owned by Flagler, the P&C steamship line, and carry on to either Cuba or Nassau. The train station for ordinary passengers was actually on so-called Main Street, which is, of course, where the median strip in Royal Poinciana Way was. And on the south side of that strip was the railroad, and on the north side of that strip was Main Street, now known as Royal Poinciana Way. You could travel between the two hotels on this mule-drawn trolley until 1928, and it would go down the Pine Walk, which is now called Coconut Walk, which is still extant between two parts of the Breakers Golf Course. So literally the year that the Royal Poinciana Hotel opened, Florida experienced the Great Freeze, and it was really cold. It was 20 degrees throughout southern Florida, and it killed all the citrus crops. So these are dead oranges, a dead orange grove. Except it didn't make it all the way, the freeze did not make it all the way down to Fort Dallas. And so one of the settlers there, Mrs. Tuttle, sent Henry Flagler a basket of citrus and said, "It hasn't frozen down here, you might want to come visit." And so he did, and he resolved to extend his railroad to Fort Dallas. And on his way, a number of new railway stations were opened up. Going from north to south, Lantana, the town was finally incorporated in 1921. Jewel, maybe it's the other way around. Jewel, Lake Worth must be before Lantana, I believe. So it should be Lantana, Lake Worth first, then Lantana, then Linton, which became Del Rey, and then Boca Raton, which only was incorporated in 1925, until it reached its current terminus in Fort Dallas. But now that it had a train station that took people to it, Fort Dallas incorporated as Miami in 1896 with a population of 300. So interestingly enough, and not surprisingly, West Palm Beach had a larger population of Miami, at least until 1896. Then Miami grew much more quickly. Another stop along the way that no longer exists was at Yamato, which is near Del Rey. And this was a fascinating adventure that was started in 1904, where a group of 40 Japanese farmers established a farming colony where they would grow pineapples. And they were actually enticed to come there by the state of Florida because they were considered to be very good farmers. with the hope that they would bring some of their skills to the local agricultural community. Unfortunately, the colony dissipated over the years, but one of their number hung around, George Muricami, who was here until he finally died in 1976. And he had accumulated a fair amount of land west of Delray Beach during his lifetime, which when he died, he donated to the city to create Muricami Museum and Japanese Gardens, which I commend to you. So the Florida East Coast Railway was certainly a major way to get to Lake Worth and Palm Beach. But while it was being built, also the what is now known as the Intracoastal Canal was built, but it was called the Florida East Coast Canal to complement the Florida East Coast Railway. And it travels the entire East Coast of, actually it goes all the way up to Chesapeake Bay now. It didn't arrive in Palm Beach and Lake Worth, however, until 1898. It took, believe it or not, 7 years to dig the canal between Jupiter Inlet and Lake Worth to replace that sawgrass channel that the earliest pioneers had to go down. And so the arrow was pointing to it. It's not quite straight, but it is dead calm. And it used to be a wonderful place to water ski because there were no waves whatsoever. But once it became developed in the 60s or 70s, speed limits were imposed, so you can no longer ski there. So what did the tourists who stayed at Henry Flagler's hotels do? They, for entertainment, well, they played golf. The first golf course was built in 1897, 9 holes, increased in 18 in 1901. They played tennis. They went swimming in the ocean next to the pier. They went fishing off of the pier. That's the breakers in the background. Sometimes they caught very big fish like this shark, hammerhead shark. They fished in Lake Worth. They participated in boat races. And they went on little excursions. And one was to Munyon's Island. They took a boat up to Munyon's Island at the north end of Lake Worth, where the inventor of Munyon's Paw, a cure for whatever ails you, built the Hygeia, which was a health spa. It did okay for a few years, but it burned down in 1917 and basically returned to nature. And now it's part of John D. MacArthur Beach State Park and can be visited via kayak. Another thing that tourists would do is get on a carriage and take a little explore. And they would go north. They could go up to the Gun Club, which opened in 1903. Or if they went even further north, they would go to the Craggan's house, the Rêve d'été, which had been expanded. They bought 35 acres overall, and they planted it with a series of exotic gardens, and therefore it became known as the Garden of Eden. And one of the gardens was a cactus garden with over 500 varieties of cactus. And this is an interesting photo because it shows you what their lake bulkhead looked like. Or you could take these wheelchairs, not so much on the, it had to be rather flat for that, but you could go south on Lake Trail, even down Jungle Road. And if you went to the end of Jungle Road on the lake, you would arrive at Alligator Joe's Alligator Farm. Pretty exotic stuff. So you had, if you didn't want exotic and you just wanted formal, you could do that too. And the Royal Poinciana Hotel had daily tea dances in the Coconut Grove that had been planted by the pioneers in 1878. And at nighttime, you could dance in the ballroom, or you went to the Beach Club, which was established in 1898. It's called the Beach Club. It was nowhere near a beach. It was on the lake, actually. And it was a restaurant and a gambling establishment. Gambling was illegal. And it was opened by E.R. Bradley, Colonel E.R. Bradley. And this is his house, which was just north of his club. So Henry Flagler's second wife, he divorced, and he married Mary Lily Keenan in 1901. And as a wedding present, he built her the 55-room Whitehall mansion, just south of his hotel. Now, it so happened, as you can see from this photo clearly, the railroad bridge arrived just between the hotel and Whitehall. This displeased Mrs. Flagler, and so the obliging husband moved it. So here's the same picture without the bridge, and he built a new bridge north of the hotel and far from the Whitehall. And here's the view from the Royal Poinciana Hotel of Whitehall, Sans Bridge. So you'll recall that Flagler bought Brailsford Point, where he built Whitehall. And this is Mr. Brailsford, the fellow who's, along with his brother, owned the land. This is in front of his first house. With the money that he got from the sale of Brailsford Point, he built the Banyans, which is quite a spectacular looking hotel house, which sadly no longer exists. It was located essentially where the parking lot of the Royal Poinciana Chapel is today, number 1 South Lake Trail, which is interesting because that shows you where the center of Palm Beach was at that time. In June 9th, 1903, the breakers burned down. And it reopened, a new, bigger, better one reopened a year later. Still, however, built of wood. So Henry Flagler saved his most ambitious project for last, and that was to extend his railroad from Miami all the way to Key West. And the idea was that the Panama Canal had just opened, and he hoped that shipping coming through the Panama Canal would stop in Key West and unload its cargo onto his railroad and then go up the coast that way. Didn't quite work out that way. Many of the ships simply kept going and went to ports on the east coast of the United States. But nevertheless, what was sometimes known as Flagler's Folly was extended after 7 arduous years at a vast expense. It cost more to build this extension from Miami to Key West than it cost to build the Florida East Coast Railway from St. Augustine to Miami. But it arrived on January 22nd, 1912, and Flagler was there for the ceremony. The railroad, the Overseas Railway, was damaged and parts of it destroyed by the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, and it was never replaced. In fact, the federal government ended up building instead the Overseas Highway using parts of the railway for the highway, but there's still many vestiges of the Overseas Railway that you can see on the wonderful drive from Miami to Key West. And Henry Morrison Flagler was without a doubt the most important man in Palm Beach, and for that matter, the most important man for Florida. he single-handedly transformed the east coast of Florida from Key West, from St. Augustine to Key West into the Florida that soon became what we know today. And that's it. So in honor of him, thank goodness, this statue was finally installed at the foot of Royal Poinciana Way not that long ago, to recognize his incredible contribution to Palm Beach. From the Flagler era, what can you still see? The Dade County Bank in West Palm Beach, the little church is still there, Royal Poinciana Plaza, the Breakers Golf Course, Whitehall, Main Street, Royal Poinciana Way, and 1 South County Road. I just mentioned that as a marker as to where the center of Flagler's Palm Beach was. Okay, I'm running slowly, but late, but here we have more to go. Last chapter in this lecture about the town of Palm Beach beyond the grand hotels of Flagler. Palm Beach became a county in 1909. It's separate from Dade County. It was carved out of that huge Dade County. And it went all the way to Stewart in the north and Pompano in the south. But subsequently, in 1915, the southern part was hived off to create part of Broward County, and the new boundary on the south became Boca Raton. And in 1925, the northern bit was cut off and to create part of Martin County, resulting in today's boundaries, basically from Jupiter in the north to Boca Raton in the south. And the county seat, West Palm Beach, the county courthouse, built in 1916. And the arrow is pointing to it here. 1917, the West Palm Beach Canal from Lake Okeechobee to Lake Worth was built, along with 4 other canals that are south of it, all of which go directly to the ocean. Ours goes into Lake Worth. And this was all part of a project to drain the land around Lake Worth for agricultural purposes, championed by the governor at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Dredge the canal. West Palm Beach Canal is 40 miles long, and it's when you're driving west on Southern Boulevard, what you're seeing on to your left is the West Palm Beach Canal leading to Lake Okeechobee. And it leads to the glades. The glades are refer to the area around the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee, primarily Bell Glade, but it goes up to Canal Point, Pahokee, Bell Glade, South Bay. These are all the glades. And this was the agricultural area drained by the canal. And it was then developed for sugar cane production. And the first sugar cane was planted in Canal Point in 1917. Finally, the town of Palm Beach was incorporated in 1911. And believe it or not, in 1911, it was only the second municipality to be incorporated in the entire county of Palm Beach. The first one, of course, was West Palm Beach in 1896. But Palm Beach, the town of Palm Beach, was the second municipality to be incorporated. And its first mayor was our friend Elisha Cap Demick, the same man that we saw who came here with his family 35 years earlier in 1876. And he was quite a guy. And one of the things that he did was to create what is known as the Royal Park Addition. Now, it's the central part of Palm Beach today. We don't necessarily think of it as being the Royal Park Addition, but that's what it is. And the arrow on the top points to Royal Poinciana Way. Sorry, Royal Palm Way. And this layout exists today. All the streets still exist today, not the plats, but these streets. And at the bottom, you see Lake Worth. I mean, Worth Avenue. On the right is the ocean. On the left is the lagoon. So we owe to Cap Demick and his partners the creation of the Heart of Palm Beach, which totally transformed Palm Beach from hotels to a real town. And to access the Royal Park addition, he built the Royal Park Bridge, only the second bridge, and this is the first one that allowed cars across it. The bridge on the north, built by Flagler, was for the train and also for pedestrians. Terrible picture on the right. That's the old original Royal Park Bridge, and the one on the left was the replacement bridge built in the 20s. This is the bottom of Royal Palm Way. All of the investors built their houses on Royal Palm Way, including Cap Demick. And this is the eastern end of Royal Palm Way. And the arrow points to 100 Royal Palm Way, from which I am speaking to you now. One of the earliest investors in Royal Park, the Royal Park Edition, was Gus Jordan, who was a Danish army officer who immigrated to the United States and ran the casino, as they call the swimming club of the breakers, until he created his own casino in 1914, which he called Gus Bath, right on the ocean at the end of what is now Lake Worth. And later, in 1924, he built the Rainbow Pier, which you can see at the top left of this image. And at the bottom, you see there's these two huge, it was another 1,000-foot long pier, just like the one at the breakers. And it had two huge saltwater pools at the bottom with the giant diving boards, diving platforms. This is in the 50s, the same place. So infrastructure, again, between 1912 and 1916, Ocean Boulevard was built down the length of the ocean, 23 miles from the inlet to Del Rey. By the Palm Beach Country Club was built on the second golf course in Palm Beach, was built off of the South Ocean Boulevard, the north end of the island. This is a later photo. The coral cut was cut in the 1920s to facilitate access to the north end of the island. Wells Road was laid out with this Australian pines. And the two inlets were built. First, so on the right, you see there was actually a modest inlet that was carved out by the pioneers in the 1870s that kept on silting up, and it wasn't a very practical inlet. So the decision was taken to build an official inlet to allow large ships to come in, and at a different location further south. So in 1918, the first inlet was built. Later in 1935, the jetties were added on either side, and the inlet was deepened not once, twice, thrice to its current depth of 35 feet. And this is a wonderful shot that shows you what we're looking at. The Port of Palm Beach at the top. On the left, that's the north end of Palm Beach. And on the right is Peanut Island. And Peanut Island was originally a so-called spoil island because all of the sand that they dredged up to create the inlet had to be dumped somewhere, and they dumped it here, creating from nothing an island, which originally had 10 acres. And as dredging continued and continues today, it's now up to 84 acres. And the little peanut island that you see on the bottom right here is now part of the big peanut island, thanks to the expansion. It was originally called Inlet Island, but the name was changed to Peanut Island because there was some peanut processing terminal located on it at one time. And so the name of the island was changed to Peanut Island. Wonderful photo from the 1920s that shows you at the top arrow is the original inlet and the bottom arrow is the new inlet before the jetties were built. View from America Transocean's Curtiss airplane. And that's what the Curtiss aircraft looked like. They were seaplanes because there were no airports in Palm Beach at that time. And some people could actually, instead of taking the train, if they wished, they could fly from Atlantic City to West Palm Beach and land in Lake Worth in 18 hours. So we had an inlet at the north end, but needed to flush out the lake. So it was important to now a lagoon because it was no longer totally enclosed. So the decision was taken to build another inlet at the narrowest point on the barrier island at Boynton Inlet. And that was done in 1925. Finally creating the island of Palm Beach, which had not been an island until 1925. And it is defined to the north by the Lake Worth Inlet and to the south by the Boynton Inlet. So Elisha Demick died in 1919, bringing a close to an era that had seen Palm Beach go from pioneer wilderness to grand hotels to building actually a legitimate town that was poised for development in the 1920s. But his statue stands at the foot of Royal Palm Way, fittingly enough, right opposite the Royal Park Bridge that he built. And he was quite a guy. He's second only to Flagler in terms of importance, certainly in the town of Palm Beach. He opened its first hotel. He co-founded its first bank. He developed the Royal Park Addition. In addition to serving as Palm Beach's first mayor, he served as a county commissioner, a member of the school board, a state representative, and a state senator. So quite a guy. And that brings us to the conclusion of my talk, the first part of the talk. And next week, we'll talk about the next 100 years from 1920 until today. Thank you very much.